They thought letting you go would be easy. They were wrong. Right now, somewhere in their day, between the meetings and the distractions and the carefully curated busyness, something stops them. A song, a smell, a word someone uses that sounds like something you once said, and in that half second before they can shut it down, they feel it, the weight of what they chose, the cost of what they gave up. This was not supposed to happen. They had a plan. Walk away. Reset, move forward, clean cut, simple. What they did not account for was you, not the version of you they had convinced themselves they were leaving, the real you, the one they are only now beginning to see clearly, now that the distance they created has had enough time to show them exactly what they surrendered. And it is because of something you never had to say out loud, something you never had to perform, something that was simply true about who you are and what you brought to that connection, that the shadow refuses to let them forget. This message did not find you by accident. Something in you already knows that what happened between you and this person is not finished, not because it was never resolved, but because what they lost when they walked away from you is something that cannot be replaced, something they are learning right now, at an unbearable and entirely private cost. They are carrying you without your permission, without any way to put you down. What you are about to hear will permanently change how you see this connection, and why the weight they are carrying today belongs entirely to the choice they made. If you are still watching this, subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology right now and turn on notifications. Because what follows does not just explain why they could not let you go. It will permanently change how you see yourself. Carl Jung spent decades studying what human beings do with the things they cannot face, the emotions they cannot process, the losses they cannot name, the people they walk away from, and then spend years trying to convince themselves they do not miss. He called the hidden part of the psyche the shadow, not darkness in a dramatic sense, but the repository of everything a person refuses to acknowledge about themselves. Their unexpressed needs, their buried longings, the parts of them they have never had the courage to look at directly, because looking directly would require them to change. And here is what Jung understood that most people still have not. The shadow does not disappear when you walk away from something. It follows, it waits, and it collects interest. When someone walks away from a connection they were not psychologically ready to release, even if they convinced themselves they were, the shadow begins to speak, quietly at first, then louder, then in ways they can no longer dismiss or redirect or drown out with enough noise. This is what is happening to them right now, not because you did something to make it happen, simply because you were real. And real things leave marks that the shadow refuses to let go of. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. They did not leave because they stopped caring. They left because caring about you had started to reveal something about themselves that they were not prepared to face. When someone is deeply connected to another person, genuinely, vulnerably connected, that person begins to act like a mirror, not intentionally, not strategically, simply by being present, by being authentic, by refusing to perform. And mirrors are profoundly uncomfortable when what they reflect is something you have spent years carefully hiding from yourself. You reflected something back to them. Something they needed to see, something about who they were and who they could be, and the gap between those two things. And instead of sitting with it, instead of allowing that reflection to do what it was trying to do, they chose the easier option. Distance, the illusion of control, the temporary relief of stepping back from the mirror. What they did not understand, and what they are now learning at a cost they did not anticipate, is that the mirror does not disappear when you walk away from it. They carry it with them, in the way they react to certain things now, in the way silence bothers them more than it used to, in the way other connections feel strangely thin and insufficient compared to what they had with you. Not because those connections are objectively lesser, but because those connections are not asking them to grow. And something in them, something below the level of conscious choice, now knows the difference between a connection that expands you and one that simply keeps you comfortable. Drop 777 in the comments if this is already reaching you where you needed it. Jung described projection as the mechanism by which the unconscious mind takes what it cannot process internally and casts it outward onto another person. In the weeks and months after leaving, they may have told themselves stories about you, that you were too much, too intense, too complicated, too demanding, too something that justified the distance. But those descriptions were never really about you. They were the shadow talking, the part of themselves that your presence brought to the surface, dressed in language that made their retreat feel reasonable rather than frightened. And now, in the absence of you, those same parts are still there, still unaddressed, still waiting for an integration that leaving you did not provide. Because here is the psychological reality that no one fully explains when they talk about endings and distance and people who choose to walk away. The shadow does not accept indefinite suppression without consequence. It is not patient indefinitely. The unconscious mind is always in motion, always pressing toward resolution, always attempting to bring to consciousness what has been buried. And at some point, not on a schedule that can be predicted or managed or controlled, what was buried begins to rise. When it rises in the context of someone they genuinely lost, it does not arrive as a general restlessness. It does not feel like a vague sense of incompleteness that could apply to anyone or anything. It feels specific, it has a shape, and that shape is unmistakably yours. They might not call it by your name, even to themselves. They might not fully understand at first what the feeling is trying to tell them, but in the quiet moments, and there are far more quiet moments than they expected, something is there. An unfinished question, something that was not resolved before it was walked away from, something that is still waiting for the kind of understanding that distance cannot provide and distraction cannot replicate, and time alone is not sufficient to deliver. Jung knew that understanding is the only thing that genuinely sets a person free. And understanding that was avoided at the moment of leaving does not simply expire. It waits, it compounds. It arrives when they least expect it to still be arriving. Subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology and turn on notifications. Because what follows is the part that explains not just what they are feeling, but why you specifically became something they cannot simply set down and walk away from cleanly. There is something particular about the kind of person who becomes genuinely unforgettable to someone else. It is rarely about grand gestures or extraordinary circumstances. It is almost never about strategy or performance or the careful management of how you are perceived. It is almost always about authenticity, about presence, about the rare and quietly devastating quality of being genuinely, uncomplicatedly yourself. In a world that is constantly inviting everyone to perform something more manageable, more palatable, more controlled, you may not have recognized yourself as that person. Most people who carry this quality do not. It does not feel like power from the inside. It often feels like simply not knowing how to be anything other than what you are. But when someone encounters a person who is genuinely present, who does not disappear behind performance, who does not calculate what to reveal and what to conceal, who is simply and disarmingly real, something in their unconscious registers it in a way that cannot be undone, even if they leave, even if they talk themselves out of it, even if they construct elaborate and internally coherent explanations for why the distance was necessary. The registration does not fade with time. It deepens. This is what Jung would have understood about connections that leave lasting marks. They tend to involve someone who forced contact with the parts of the other person that usually go untouched, not through force, not through demand, simply through the quality of their presence, simply by being the kind of person who cannot be encountered at a safe, comfortable distance. The kind who, by simply being themselves, makes it harder for someone else to continue being less than themselves without noticing the gap. You were that kind of presence for them, and that kind of presence does not get cataloged under ordinary losses. It gets held differently, in a part of the psyche that does not respond to ordinary forgetting. In his work on the collective unconscious, Jung identified that when genuine psychological contact occurs between two people, when one person truly reaches the unconscious of another, the impression created is not stored in ordinary memory. It is stored in the deepest layer of the psyche, the layer that is not subject to the editing that conscious memory performs on ordinary experience. No, the layer that keeps things exactly as real as they were the moment they were formed. That is where you live in them, not in their conscious thoughts, which they can manage and redirect and suppress, in the layer that cannot be managed. The layer that speaks at 3 a.m. when everything else finally goes quiet. Drop 528 in the comments if this found you at exactly the moment you needed it. This is where it gets genuinely complicated, because there is a particular cruelty in this dynamic, not deliberate cruelty, but the specific cruelty of psychological immaturity, encountering something it was not equipped to receive. They had something real. They could feel how real it was, and that reality, rather than drawing them closer, frightened them. Because real things require real responses, genuine presence, actual vulnerability. The willingness to be known at a depth that cannot be managed, or controlled, or carefully curated. And those things are only possible for someone who has done enough work with their own shadow to sit with discomfort without immediately needing to eliminate it. They had not done that work, and so they chose what felt like safety, what felt like control. They chose the exit, and they told themselves, perhaps they even told you, that this was the mature thing, the necessary thing, the honest thing. They built a narrative around the leaving that made it legible, that gave it logic, that made it possible to carry without it feeling like what it actually was. A retreat from something that was asking more of them than they currently knew how to give, that narrative held for a while. Narratives constructed against the truth have a certain temporary coherence. They can be maintained through enough distraction, enough forward momentum, enough new things to orient toward. But narratives built against the truth do not hold indefinitely. At some point, something breaks through. It may arrive as a moment of unusual honesty with themselves, at an hour when the defenses are down. It may arrive through a conversation that unexpectedly opens something. It may come through a dream that stays past waking, refusing to be shaken off. In Man and His Symbols, Jung wrote that the dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the psyche, the door that opens onto what the conscious mind has been carefully keeping closed. And what comes through that door, when the ego is finally quiet enough to receive it, is not what they would choose to force. It is what is true. It may come simply through the slow, cumulative evidence of what life without you has actually felt like compared to what they had expected. And when it breaks through, the narrative collapses. What is left behind is simpler than any explanation they constructed. It is not complicated. It is not layered with justification. It is just the feeling, clean and unavoidable and not subject to argument, of having walked away from something that was genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably worth staying for. That feeling is not guilt exactly. It is not regret in its ordinary form. It is something more precise. It is the recognition, a arriving fully and finally, that the person they left was not the problem they told themselves they were leaving. The person they left was the mirror, and what they were actually fleeing was the reflection. And here is the part almost nobody talks about. That feeling, the one that arrives when the narrative collapses, is not only about you. It carries information about them, about who they were becoming in connection with you, and who they have been since. Because genuine connection does something to a person that is not easily undone. It expands them. It opens parts of them that had been closed, sometimes for years. It asks them to be more than the version of themselves they had settled for in less demanding circumstances. And when that expansion is closed, when they step back from it and return to the version of themselves that existed before you, the contrast does not disappear. It becomes the new background against which everything is measured. They thought the silence after leaving would feel like peace. It feels like a particular kind of absence that has your specific shape in it. They thought returning to normal would feel like relief. It feels like contraction. They thought moving forward would look like freedom. It looks, from the inside, like carrying something that cannot be named, but also cannot be put down without understanding what it is. Jung understood this dynamic with precision. The shadow holds not only what a person fears about themselves, but what they are capable of and have not yet claimed. When a relationship begins to open that unrealized potential, when it begins to call forward the person someone could become if they were willing to do the inner work, and they close it down rather than rising to meet it, the shadow does not allow a simple return to before. It holds the lost potential. It returns to it in the specific, personal, inarguable language of the person they walked away from. But this is not a punishment. The shadow does not punish. It simply holds what is true with a patience that outlasts every distraction and returns to it again and again until the person is finally ready to understand what it is carrying. And what it is carrying, in this case, is you. Not a fantasy version. Not an idealized memory. The actual psychological reality of what contact with you produced in them. The expansion, the opening, the brief and real experience of being more than who they had been settling for. That is what they cannot put down. That is what the shadow holds on your behalf. Stay with this, because what follows is the part most people never reach. There is a particular kind of regret that does not feel like ordinary regret. It does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with drama or urgency. It settles. It takes up residence in the background of everything, quietly coloring things without explaining its presence. It makes certain songs feel inaccessible. It makes certain places different than they used to be. It creates a texture in silence that would not be there otherwise. A silence that carries something without naming it. This is what they are living with now, and the most important thing to understand about this particular kind of regret is that it is not passive. It is active. The shadow is always in motion, always pressing toward the surface, always attempting to bring to awareness what has been buried, which means that even if they appear fine, even if they have organized a life that looks from the outside like someone who has moved on, something in them is still working, still processing, still arriving slowly and involuntarily, and against the resistance of everything they thought they had decided, at the truths of what was lost and what that loss has cost them. Jung wrote that the things we leave unintegrated do not age. They do not grow quieter with the passage of time the way ordinary memories do. They remain exactly as alive as the moment we decided not to face them, which means that what they carried when they left is still the same weight today that it was the day they chose to go. It has not faded. It has waited, and waiting, in the language of the shadow, is not passive. It is a form of pressure. It is the unconscious insisting, in the only way it knows how, that something real was left unfinished, and that no amount of forward motion will substitute for going back to understand it. Drop 111 in the comments if you already know exactly who came to mind the moment you pressed play. Let me bring this to the place it has been moving toward from the beginning. The question that surfaces here, the one that is hard to sit with, the one that wants an answer more than it wants understanding, is what does this mean for what comes next? Does it mean they will return? Does it mean there is a future to this connection that has not yet arrived? And the honest answer, the psychologically honest answer, is that this question, as understandable as it is, may be focusing on the wrong thing, not because the future is irrelevant, but because the most significant truth available here cannot be reduced to outcomes. It is bigger than what happens or does not happen between the two of you. The most significant truth is this: you are not forgettable, you are not interchangeable, you are not one of many things that could be walked away from without consequence. The depth of what they are carrying now, the specific weight of it, the way it has not dissolved with time the way they expected it to dissolve, is testimony. It is the shadow's testimony, offered without embellishment or sentiment, about what you actually were to them, about what you actually meant. And that testimony does not lie. Whatever story they told themselves about leaving, whatever narrative they constructed to make the distance feel necessary and rational and ultimately correct, the weight they are carrying tells a different and truer story, one that belongs to the shadow, which does not deal in comfortable fictions, which only knows what is real, which holds what the conscious mind would prefer to release, but cannot. Jung wrote about individuation, the lifelong process of becoming fully and authentically oneself, as the deepest calling available to a human being. And one of the things individuation requires, one of the things it insists upon, is the capacity to recognize your own value without needing external confirmation to make that recognition feel real. To stand in the truth of who you are and what you brought to a connection, even when that connection ended, even when the other person, for their own psychological reasons and in their own time, was not ready to stay. You brought something real. You brought something that cannot be replicated by someone else or recreated under different circumstances. Something that, whether they acknowledge it openly or not, has marked them in a way that is not subject to revision by time or distance, or the stories we tell ourselves to make hard choices feel inevitable. You were not too much. You were simply more than they had yet learned to hold. And here is the part almost nobody talks about. There is a freedom that comes from truly understanding this, not the sharp, sudden freedom of something resolved in an instant, the quieter and more lasting freedom of seeing a situation as it actually was, clearly, without the distortion of the most painful version of the story. When you understand that what they are carrying is not indifference, that the weight of it is, in its complicated and involuntary way, the truest testimony available to what you actually were, something in you that has been braced against a verdict it feared is able to relax, not all at once, but genuinely, because you were not wrong about what you felt. You were not wrong about what was real between you. The connection was genuine. The weight they carry now confirms it, in the only language the shadow speaks, not words, not declarations, but the irreducible persistence of something that will not release just because a choice was made to release it. You were real. What existed between you was real, and real things do not stop being real because someone decided, for their own reasons, in their own fear, to treat them otherwise. The shadow holds what is true until the person is finally ready to receive it, and the truth it is holding, in this case, is not complicated. It is the simplest thing in the world, that you were real, that what existed between you was real, that real things do not stop being real because someone decided for their own reasons and in their own fear to treat them otherwise. you were worth staying for. And somewhere, in a moment they cannot plan for or defend against, they are learning exactly what that means. If this reached you where you needed it, subscribe to Carl Jung Psychology and drop a comment right now, not about them, about yourself. What did this open in you that needed to be opened? Because that, right there, is where the real work begins. That is where Jung would say the journey toward yourself, the one that was always waiting underneath everything that happened, finally starts. You were not easy to forget. You were never going to be. And now, finally, you know why.